Imagine you are a Roman legionary stationed at the edge of the known world. You have marched 20 miles in full kit. You have fought barbarians at the frontier, an arrow is lodged in your shoulder, or a Dacian falx has sliced your arm open. What happens next? For most armies in the ancient world, the answer was simple. You bled out, you died of infection, or you were left crippled. But for a Roman soldier in the 2nd century AD, there was another option. You were carried to a building at the center of the fortress, a building that the Romans called a valetudinarium, a military hospital, and what happened inside that building was nothing less than a revolution in the economics of warfare. Rome did not invent the idea of caring for wounded soldiers, but Rome was the first civilization in history to build a standardized, state-funded hospital system for its army, and it did this not out of charity, but out of cold, hard economic calculation. Each legionary represented an enormous investment of state resources. Training a single soldier took years. His equipment, armor, shield, pilum, gladius, cost hundreds of denarii. His pay, food, and supplies cost the treasury hundreds more every year. Losing a trained soldier to a preventable wound was like throwing money into the Tiber. The valetudinarium was an economic instrument designed to protect that investment. And the evidence we have today, from the ruins of legionary fortresses across Europe, shows just how sophisticated that instrument was. The best preserved example of a legionary hospital comes from a place that seems unlikely for Rome, the Highlands of Scotland. At Inchtoothiel, northeast of Perth, the 20th Legion built a fortress around 83 AD during the campaigns of Agricola. The fortress was occupied for only about 3 years before being abandoned. But in that short time, the Legion constructed a valetudinarium that Sir Ian Richmond, the great scholar of Roman military archaeology, called the finest surviving example of its kind anywhere in the empire. The building was enormous, roughly 90 meters by 50 meters. Inside were 60 small rooms arranged around a central courtyard, connected by a covered corridor. Each room was about 4 meters square, big enough for 4 to 6 bedridden patients. In total, the hospital could accommodate between 250 and 500 soldiers at a time. But here is the critical point. The plan of the valetudinarium at Inchtoothiel is almost identical to those found at Novasium in Germany, at Haltern, at Carnuntum on the Danube, and at Nove on the lower Danube in what is now Bulgaria. The Roman army standardized its hospital design across the entire empire. Whether you were injured in Scotland, Germany, or Syria, the building where you received treatment would be essentially the same. This standardization is not just architectural trivia. It tells us that the Roman army treated medical care as a logistical system, something to be planned, budgeted, and replicated wherever legions were stationed. The design itself was engineered for healing. The floors were raised off the ground to allow air circulation and prevent damp. The partitions between rooms were double-walled for insulation and noise control. High windows let in light and air while maintaining privacy. The rooms opened onto a covered corridor that led to an inner courtyard where convalescing soldiers could exercise and get fresh air. At Novasium, archaeologists found evidence that a large room near the entrance was used for reception and triage, assessing patients to determine who needed urgent care. A smaller adjacent room contained the sterilization area where surgical instruments and bandages were boiled before use. This was not primitive battlefield medicine. This was a purpose-built, scientifically designed medical facility, and it appeared on the Roman frontier within decades of the imperial system being established. Who ran these hospitals? The evidence from inscriptions, papyri, and literary sources reveals a surprisingly sophisticated medical hierarchy. At the top was the medicus castrorum, or camp physician. He commanded the entire medical service of the legion. He was assisted by a deputy called the optio valetudinarii, literally the hospital option, the executive officer who ran the day-to-day administration. Below them were the medici, doctors assigned to individual cohorts or to specialized roles. These medici were not just soldiers with basic first aid training. Many were Greek-trained physicians who had studied at the great medical schools of Alexandria, Pergamon, and Kos. We know from documents like the Vindolanda tablets, the ink-writing tablets found at Hadrian's Wall, that soldiers routinely reported sick, requested medical leave, and were examined by military physicians. The Roman army took illness seriously enough to track it administratively. Then there were the capsari. These were the combat medics, soldiers detailed from the ranks who carried bandages, capsae, and provided immediate first aid on the battlefield. They were trained to dress wounds, apply tourniquets, and carry the wounded to the rear. In battle, capsari moved among the fighting ranks, treating injuries in real time, a practice virtually unknown in any other ancient army. The economic advantage of this system is obvious. Enemy armies, whether Celtic, Germanic, or Parthian, had no organized medical care. A wounded Celtic warrior was a casualty to be mourned. A wounded Roman soldier was a patient to be treated and returned to duty. Over the course of a long campaign, this difference accumulated. An army that could recover even 30% of its wounded was an army that could stay in the field longer, fight more battles, and project power more effectively than an enemy that lost every wounded man permanently. Let's put numbers on this. A legion at full strength contained about 5,000 men. In a major battle, casualty rates of 15 to 25% were common. Without medical care, that legion loses 1,000 to 1,200 soldiers permanently, killed or disabled for life. With an effective valetudinarium system, Rome might save half of those. 500 to 600 trained soldiers returned to duty. The cost of training, equipping, and paying a legionary over 25 years of service was roughly 15,000 denarii in base pay alone, not counting equipment, food, and discharge bonuses. Saving 600 soldiers meant preserving an investment of 9 million denarii. The cost of building and staffing a valetudinarium was a fraction of that. The valetudinarium could not function without a supply chain that stretched across the known world, and the Roman army was uniquely equipped to create one. Consider the medical instruments. Roman surgical tools were precision-crafted items made of bronze and steel, materials that required specialized metallurgy. Scalpels, probes, forceps, retractors, bone drills, catheters, and cauterization irons were produced in workshops in Italy and shipped to the frontier. A single set of surgical instruments could cost as much as a soldier's annual pay. The sheer variety of instruments is staggering. Unearthed at Pompeii, at the house of the surgeon, archaeologists found over 40 distinct types of surgical tools. The military hospitals at Novaesium and Carnuntum yielded hundreds of instruments, scalpels, probes, hooks, forceps, needles, and a variety of specialized tools for extracting arrowheads and treating fractures. These instruments were not crude. Roman scalpels were made with a bronze handle and an interchangeable steel blade, the same basic design as modern surgical scalpels. The Romans had vaginal speculums, bone drills for cranial surgery, and catheters for relieving urinary blockages. Their forceps could extract arrowheads embedded deep in flesh. Their bone saws could amputate limbs in under a minute. Then there were the medicines. The Roman military pharmacy drew ingredients from across the empire and beyond. Opium from Asia Minor and Egypt for pain relief. Silphium from Cyrene, now Libya, used as a panacea for everything from fever to gangrene. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia for antiseptic ointments. Cinnamon from East Africa. All of these traveled thousands of miles along Roman trade routes to reach the frontier hospitals. But not everything had to travel far. At Novaesium, archaeologists found evidence that medicinal plants, including centaury, henbane, and St. John's wort, were grown in the grounds of the hospital itself. At the Roman fort of Bearsden in Scotland, traces of celery were found in what was probably a medicinal garden. The army was self-sufficient for the basics, but relied on long-distance trade for specialized remedies. The economic implications are significant. The medical supply chain of the Roman army created demand across the empire. Linens for bandages were produced in Gaul and shipped north. Wine, used as an antiseptic and disinfectant, was imported into every frontier fort. Olive oil for cleansing wounds followed the same routes. The army was the largest single customer for many of these goods, and the medical system was a significant part of that demand. Let's talk about actual costs. A legionary in the 1st century AD earned about 900 sestertia per year, around 225 denarii. By the time of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, that had risen to perhaps 3,600 sesterban, 900 denarii, but inflation had eroded much of the real value. But the soldier's pay tells only part of the story. The real cost of a legionary to the state was much higher. His equipment, helmet, armor, shield, 2 javelins, a sword, a dagger, cost roughly 500 denarii to produce. His food, grain, meat, oil, wine, salt, and cheese cost the state about 250 denarii per year in deductions and subsidies. And at the end of his 25-year service, he received a discharge bonus of 12,000 sestertii, or a land grant, a retirement cost equal to over 13 years of his annual pay. The mathematics of this are straightforward. Losing a trained soldier cost the Roman state anywhere from 10,000 to 16,000 denarii in lost investment. Saving a soldier through medical care cost perhaps 500 denarii in supplies, staff time, and amortized hospital construction. The return on investment was enormous, something on the order of 30 to 1. This is why the Roman army invested in medical care when no other ancient army did. It was not just humane, it made economic sense, and the scale of this investment was large. At least 30 valetudinaria have been identified on the Rhine-Danube frontier alone, with many more in Britain. Each legionary fortress had one. Many auxiliary forts had smaller versions. The total hospital capacity of the Roman army in the 2nd century AD, at a time when the army numbered roughly 400,000 men, probably exceeded 10,000 beds. No other state in antiquity came close to providing this level of medical care for its soldiers. But the valetudinarium did not serve only soldiers. The evidence from inscriptions and grave markers suggests that military doctors also treated civilians, the inhabitants of the Canabae, the civilian settlements that grew up around every permanent fort. This created a second economic effect, access to Greek medical knowledge for provincial populations who would never otherwise have encountered it. Celtic and Germanic communities living near Roman forts gained contact with trained physicians, surgical techniques, and medical herbs from across the empire. This was not charity, it was a form of soft power. When the local chieftain's son was healed by a Roman doctor, that was a political asset. And when soldiers retired after 25 years of service, many of them settled in the provinces where they had served. Former Medici often opened civilian practices. The valetudinarium thus acted as a training ground, producing a steady stream of medically trained veterans who spread Roman medical knowledge throughout the provinces. This was, in effect, a state-subsidized medical education system, centuries before any European state would attempt anything similar. The Roman military hospital system lasted at least 300 years. It survived through the reigns of dozens of emperors, through economic crises and military disasters. It was sustained not because the Romans were especially kind or enlightened, they were not, but because it worked. It returned soldiers to duty. It made the army more efficient. It reduced the long-term cost of maintaining the empire's most expensive asset, its professional military force. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, the valetudinarium system fell with it. The Gothic and Frankish kingdoms that replaced Roman rule had no concept of a military hospital. Wounded soldiers were left to die or to be cared for by their comrades in the field without any organized medical system. It would take Europe until the Napoleonic Wars, more than 1,300 years later, to develop medical services that rivaled those of the Roman legions. And even then, Napoleon's battlefields were slaughterhouses compared to the relatively organized care a Roman soldier could expect in the 2nd century. The valetudinarium was more than a building. It was a statement about what the Roman state owed its soldiers, and about what those soldiers were worth. In economic terms, the military hospital was one of the most cost-effective investments the Roman Empire ever made. A wounded legionary was not a lost cause. He was an asset to be repaired and returned to service. 300 years of European history forgot this lesson. The Romans did not. The valetudinarium proves that the most powerful force in ancient medicine was not a miracle drug or a brilliant doctor. It was an accountant, working out that saving a soldier paid more than losing one.